Welcome to this afternoon's Visiting Artists Lecture with John Mann. My name is Jack Snell Ryan, and I am a professor and the Director of Graduate Studies for the Department of Arts MFA program. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that the land we are broadcasting from and the places that this university has used to live and work in is the occupied territory of the Kalapuya people and the Confederate tribes of the Grand Ronde. With tonight's remote gathering, I'd like to acknowledge their stewardship of this land. And so thank you for joining us. Today's lecture by John Mann might be one of the most coveted in our Visiting Artists Lecture series because it comes directly from our remarkable MFA graduate candidates who collectively curate and arrive at an artist whose practice activates facets of their collective sensibility. John's beautiful practice occupies hybridized sculptural space through the lens of photography and drawing, which nicely speaks to our graduate candidates' interest in interdisciplinarity. So I'll hand the mic over now to third-year graduate candidate Nathan Ward, who spearheaded John's visit and will share an introduction. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Jack. I'm excited to host the Department of Arts' first graduate-initiated lecture. As Jack mentioned, my name is Nathan Ward. I'm a Master of Fine Arts candidate here at the University of Oregon, currently working through my third and final year in the program. Earlier this year, myself and the members of my cohort were given the opportunity to contribute programming to this year's Visiting Artists Lecture series. I feel quite fortunate to have been able to extend an invitation to John Mann. I first encountered John's work roughly 10 years ago at the beginning of my undergraduate studies at West Virginia University, where it had a notable impact on my development as an artist and continues to be an inspiration today. John Mann is an artist who explores the visual complications of photography, sequence, and still life through printed images, artist books, and sculptural works. His artwork has been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions at venues such as Aperture, Lightwork, Daniel Cooney Fine Art, Jen Beckman Projects in New York, more locally at PDX Contemporary and New Space for Photography in Portland, as well as many other locations around the country and abroad. I want to thank everyone for being here today to hear John deliver his lecture, The Walled Garden. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the airways over to you, John. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much to the University of Oregon and Nathan and Jack. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today in a sort of virtual way, I suppose, but nonetheless, I feel honored to be asked and included in the conversation of your community. So today, I was asked if I would share a studio visit or something. I'm going to just preclude this talk by saying that I just moved to Chicago, and so some of those things are still getting worked out, but nonetheless, happy to share the work that I've done with you in this format. So I wanted to begin by thinking about, for me, what photography is and what art making is. Largely, my practice is informed by photography, the history of photography, but so much by the history of sculpture and the history of drawing, other things. So I wanted to think about, well, what makes a photograph? And so sort of the through line of what might tonight's talk be about is what matters to me when I look at a photograph, which will thereby determine what matters when I make a photograph. And so I wanted to start out with this found photograph for me, found image in the public resource of the Library of Congress, digital archives. And this is an image that is pretty incredible for me. And I sort of thought, talking through it, how I see it could be insightful for how I see the making of my own work. This is an image that was made, some time ago, probably 100 years ago, longer than that, probably. And so what we're looking at is an image that is divorced from our own context. So even the information at the bottom of the screen, lacking some kind of knowledge of the history of the place where these objects came, that information is a context loss to me as well. So I have the information of the photograph, the literalness of the photograph showing me, in this case, an image that's split into two, But by the time this image is made, photography itself had trained us to think that this was somehow related to the stereograph or some sort of double vision. But upon closer examination, you see that this is not the same photograph, just repeated twice, or one made for the right eye and one made for the left eye, that in fact, this is two different images. What's exciting to me about this image is that there is a trick of the eye. There's a kind of a knowledge or an understanding that you get by looking at the left-hand side that you think that you can then just apply to the right. And that's by no means exactly what's going on. There's been movement, there's been a change in the sequence, in the scene at that point. And in some way, that little subtle shift now creates a narrative. There's been something changed. The photographer or whoever had decided that one view is not as good, or maybe needs to change to a second view. Also is the way that the image is presented. Certain pieces of this small game seem to float upon a black space in a way that the eye can't quite understand. Of course, these are pieces on some sort of black fabric, perhaps, but in a way that this simple, the literalness of the photograph, in a way, is not so simple. It's not just showing you necessarily what's in front of the camera. It's also at the same time tricking you by showing exactly what's there. That the clues of that single image, I think, will follow through on much of the work that I present tonight. And so I'm going to start around 2005, in which I was about ready to make a trip to the Appalachian Trail to photograph through hikers, and a sort of portraiture project for people who are taking this long road through a place. In this case, this arbitrary line that follows through the Appalachian Mountains. And so I went to do some research about other historical travel photography. And what I found in research at several museums was that certain of these types of travel albums from the 19th century had a more complicated history to them than what I would have imagined. In fact, what we're looking at here are pages from an album where the images are made by professionals, as would have been the case in the 19th century. And yet the language that goes along with them sometimes is factual, that almost like they're illustrating their own encyclopedia of these places. But sometimes these photographic albums also include almost personal anecdotes, as if the person had gone through these places and made these photographs themselves, which they very much didn't. So they used the photographs as a stand-in for their own experience, which in the 19th century, photography was largely outside of the average person's human experience in terms of making the photograph. And so the images stood in for their own experience, either real experience of travel to, in this case, the Middle East, or imagined space by the collecting of the images and then the creation of a kind of fictional narrative that went along with it. And so the photograph allowed a sense of travel and a sense of proof that may or may not have existed in these early 19th century images. And that's kind of a powerful, both fictional and non-fictional narrative that happens out of that. And so my trip to the Appalachian Mountains did result in a number of portraits of these through hikers that were making this sort of monumental journey. But I came back from the trip thinking that I'd largely missed the whole point of the trip. Somehow their sort of philosophical journey was not enough to capture, and certainly the portraits themselves didn't do that. And so on my way home, I started to think about all the places I hadn't been, how many places I was never going to get to, and how could I somehow visit those places. And so I was in the car with my fold-out map and then pointing a point-and-shoot camera at the map and thinking, like, maybe I can somehow have access to these places just through my camera itself. And so upon return, I started to think about how those maps became this kind of amazing stand-in, just like the photograph, a flattened space that is then unpacked in a different context and then can be understood without that context. And so with basic rudimentary materials, I was interested in sort of rethinking the space of these faraway places, in this case now beyond the scope of the Appalachian Mountains, but now thinking about how could I access, mentally at least, these places that seem so far away? How could the photograph, if the map itself is an abstraction, a sort of a drawing of a actual real space, how could the photograph itself, an abstraction of a real place, somehow animate that place into a real experience, somehow pretend or make it into a three-dimensional space? Is there a way that there could be like a place that comes out of these two abstractions? And so out of that, I had to think about, I had to think about, well, what makes a photograph, or at least a landscape photograph? And so I was thinking about this Man Ray image of the Duchamp piece and how it really provided all the clues I needed to think about what makes a landscape photograph. And we're looking at this image of dust that is forming on the top of this Duchamp piece. And it really provides the key. In this case, we have a kind of, we read this image as almost one would read overlooking a field, a valley of different farmers' fields or something like that. We have a kind of almost a godlike view, and we have this assumed horizon. There was no reason for Man Ray to keep the top fifth of the image if he didn't also believe that that was critical to it acting as a landscape photograph, because that top portion has no information, but it serves as a counterpoint to this receding space that's happening in the photograph. And so we have this sort of aerial view, we have this assumed horizon line, and we have this receding space, all which are the same kind of clues to many landscape photographs. And so as I returned to this, I was using some of those similar things, not making the exact same photograph as the Man Ray, but thinking about, well, what are the kind of basic requirements to be thinking about a space, a faraway space, or even a space that recedes in front of the camera. And how could I create a sort of understanding of that landscape, that faraway landscape, in front of my own lens, even if I was to never travel to a certain place? And so these became photographs of basically the abstractions of maps that then I hoped would reanimate them into a three-dimensional photographic space. And so this project became the beginning of thinking about a term that has followed me since that time, this term called optical confusion. And so in this case, looking at this and reading this void as a blackened space, but it also as a rounded space. Does it come forward? Does it recede? Or does it eclipse this side? Because we have so much association with this kind of globe or circular thing that's eclipsed it, it has a kind of understanding like we might think of as the moon. And so this idea that the photograph, while being terribly literal, can also be at the same time, by giving you all the information, is it somehow also tricking your eye into believing something it's not even showing you? And so that kind of idea will come up throughout different images, not in every single image, but certainly throughout much of my work. And so in like an image like this, it was just thinking about the abstractions, in this case of the oceans themselves, that are often in maps that are total voids. The map is showing the largest percentage of the earth as a void. And so to think about how I could somehow do that space some justice, or not to make it somehow less of a void, but somehow to animate that space. Oops, I guess that's, oops. And something like this, and just thinking about the sensations of what small gestures do to the eye when looking at a photograph. In this case, the cuts of this map, and how does that feel on the eye as one looks at it. As much of my early studies in photography were in 19th century photographic processes, I'm fairly well versed in the sort of a lot of the imagery that happened. And in this case, this is an image actually from the 20th century, but early 20th century, and thinking about like this Lartigue photograph of how, in this case, this image kind of represents the beginning of the amateur camera. And then thinking about, in this case, like a 6-year-old boy making an image that has none of the history of art along with it, and how that opened up new visual styles. In this case, this, for the first time, starts to present a photograph that actually might help us understand the vision of a child. And so that was something that photography really hadn't taken on up until that point. And so thinking about this again as this space that receives, that has a horizon, even though we're clearly in the child's bedroom, it also follows these same threads. Of course, Frith's image of Egypt as well is also, as a map is, a total abstraction. In fact, the common viewer for this photograph would have been in England, and seeing this photograph without these figures, the image would have been unreadable in some ways. And so he needed to include some code that was possible to unpack the image. And I like the idea that the image is so abstract, even though it's so terribly literal. Every stone is shown, and yet somehow that image would be very difficult to read for the viewer at that time. So thinking about that, thinking about the ideas of how a photograph could change narration, change context, those kinds of things. I think it's helpful to sort of give the background of this little book that I made, which was, I went to a residency, and the project that I was going to do completely fell flat, and I was a little bit under pressure in the face of the other residents to sort of come up with something kind of ingenious. And so so I just ordered like a toy airplane kit that was made for 8-year-olds, and they were all like, "This is the greatest project ever, John, you're going to make this toy kit." And I was, it was sort of funny because it was ridiculous, but I had to then start to think about, like, well, somehow instinctually I thought that this was a good idea, and so I just started working on it. And so this book that resulted is just this small sort of thinking, again, sort of largely based on, if we think back to the Lartigue image, in this case, we have these kind of very hard to decipher images that lack context. If you stumbled into these, you would maybe wonder what you're even looking at or why you're looking at them. And it's this sequence. So the whole book itself is kind of one idea. It's not a book of single images. It's kind of like a small, I think of it as kind of a small paper film. And so this book starts with this sequence of images of this, some kind of construction. The scale is somewhat, you're able to somewhat decipher the scale, but in some other ways it's hard to know kind of what the point of what we're looking at is here. And so as these images kind of build, you start to sense that, okay, this is this toy plane. And so the plane becomes closer and closer until it's finally built. And then the built plane becomes ready to go. And what I was interested in was not the building of this plane per se, but how could I take the plane and then somehow use it to show narratives that I couldn't access another way? So how could I, in this slight shift that's happening here, you see the plane taking off, and then somehow it's now going into heights that, you know, are unlikely. So then thinking about, now we've had the shift from the person who's making this plane into the shift to the view from the plane. And so thinking about this place, this kind of shift in narration that would have could regularly happens in film, but how can this happen in a sort of short sequential book? And so the plane sort of becomes this now into ambiguous space that then dissolves into a completely other space at the end. So I'm not showing you, I don't think, every photograph, but I'm showing you that it kind of comes out and then kind of lands in this abstracted landscape, I guess, is what we might think of as this map. And so the idea of taking multiple vantage points to a landscape that then becomes an abstraction. This image here is of garden, you know, a plan of a very formal European garden design. And I bring this in because I have been involved in some means or other with the landscape or gardening for like 30 years. And so the idea of thinking about and managing the garden is something that has been a large part of my life in terms of either as employment or as just a sort of history of thinking about that. And when I look at something like this, I think that this is a map for a way of moving through a planned space. And within that, this as an image doesn't terribly excite me, but this as the idea of what happens when people plan gardens is that they're thinking about composition, they're thinking about movement through space, they're thinking about geometries and other types of things. But as we look at this, we see that there may even be plans for different types of plants or types of formations that might be happening within those. And if we enter a space like that, we can see that those plans can come to fruition. But one thing that I think about when I think about an image like this, or a garden plan, or formal gardens, or even your own backyard garden, is that the garden is a space filled with natural plants. And the natural plants exist. They are dependent on natural occurrences and things that would happen similarly in nature. But the garden itself is not nature. It is not a natural system. This is very much a planned system that is produced by humans that want to put plants in certain ways. And as much as we want to produce even a wildflower garden in our yard, we're producing it in a way that's adjacent to other structures that we've also had planned or organized. And so the garden itself becomes a space which has infinite compositional possibilities. It also looks like nature, but it doesn't, it's not natural. And so that, for me, has been something that has carried over into thinking about photography. It looks like reality, and perhaps it is, but it is not the reality. The photograph isn't the reality. And so thinking about this and these other projects, I started to think about, kind of following on the previous projects, is to think about things that I could never go to like I did before, but to think about the landscape, the places of the thing, and to think about the photograph as a space that had this infinite compositional opportunity. And while it looked like a potential real place. It had the effect, the literalness of photographing a real place. It was not, it was also a place for kind of make-believe. And so this project called Pack Ice was it was a sort of 2-year meditation on thinking about how could I envision what it felt like for the first Arctic explorers? What would that possibly feel like? And so these images were to think about what that space might feel like, and they became more abstract as I worked, but still always having the traits. There was no necessarily no trickery to it. It was all based on sort of very rudimentary means, but there was thinking about ideas of, again, this optical confusion, the flatness of the image or flatness of part of it, then in some ways so flat that it becomes non-photographic in a way. But then in this case, like the shadow kind of has a photographic depth, but this sort of eyepiece or whatever seems to sit right on the surface of the photograph. And so thinking about where that sort of cultivated space for imagination could begin, for composition could begin, and then just showing something in front of the camera that really had nothing to do with the reality of a place. I'm not sure if this image shows up so well on people's screens or not. So as I sort of continue to work, I get further and further away from documenting a place, from even necessarily going with a specific idea. In this case, I had a vague idea of trying to just imagine the light that the first Arctic explorers had. And that's really all I had. It wasn't a conceptual illustration project. I wasn't trying to illustrate those things necessarily. I was just trying to think of what would the light feel like on their eyes when they first made those explorations. And so whether or not these all do that or not is not the point. They're not to illustrate that. That's just the sort of jumping off point. That's sort of how I began the project. This project here, as I did the last book, and I've done numerous little zines and things like this. I grew up skateboarding for many years. I still do it, but within that culture of skateboarding was photography in the 80s and 90s. And within that was making zines and other things. And so my interest in 19th century processes then sort of morphed into thinking about bookmaking and other types of projects where I would make my own books or books with other artists. And so here's another little small book. This was a book that literally happened in like 2 days, to think about like a small book. And so this was this book called The Fire Is Behind You. So perhaps this is this builds off my sort of thinking about what a landscape photograph is and what results from, what's necessary to even have it be read as a landscape photograph. These were all risograph prints. Again, these books are not to, these are meant to be small ideas. The books that I make, in terms of, they're kind of one idea that fulfills itself as a small sequence or a sort of film in these books. That was sort of an abrupt transition. I apologize for that. This image is of Cézanne's garden in Aix-en-Provence, France. And what's unique about this image, I'm sorry, this place, if you've been, is that you are in typical French style. You're sort of would believe that something like important site like this would have an amazing garden. And when you get there, Cezanne Studios in the middle of it, and you have this garden space around. It's actually just almost like a tangle of weeds. It's nothing to write home about as a garden, which was kind of how he preferred that. It wasn't a formal space. It wasn't like the formal designs that I just showed a couple minutes ago. It was more of a rampant space, and that was to his sort of specifications in some ways, that it should be left wild. And what's interesting about that is, to me, that this is how he really viewed this space. He would go out into nature, make observations, make the beginnings of paintings, and then come back and in front of this window, finish off those paintings in the sort of the shadow of nature. And that this view, this singular view, was going to inadvertently influence his painting, whether it's through the way light came through, whether it was through the time of year, or the reference of colors that would provide as he worked back in other paintings. But that windowed space, the space of that rectangle, would somehow be the entry to a landscape that was beyond, in which the walls of the garden were sort of revealed, the space of the garden was revealed. And that, for me, is a kind of a important thing, thinking about how, now that it's becoming winter here in Chicago, that's how my experience is of nature, and how that kind of distance view is almost the same as this experience of the photograph. In this project called The Echoes Wait, this project was thinking about this kind of, it became even more of a pared down set of ideas about what could happen in front of the camera. And this became thinking just purely about form in front of the camera, and what could space be if it was just form. In this case, thinking about, again, picking up on previous ideas of this as a void, this as a three-dimensional object, this is a space that's dark, which we normally read as being receding, but it's coming forward, it's in the front. And so these kind of optical elements, that not optical trickery, but idea that there's some kind of optical confusion that's happening there. These two small items on the bottom are small dice that you see on the bottom there. As I kind of move forward through this lecture, I feel like I have a little bit less to say about each photograph, or even photographic projects. I kind of feel like I'm back to that beginning photograph from the Library of Congress, where there's so many questions that I have left unanswered about the photograph. In this way, as I move forward with my work going into the future, I find that the photographs that I make need to have some lingering questions for me. I need to know that I can't quite understand them. And so while they have maybe less of a conceptual beginning, they need to have that lingering mystery that I can't quite understand. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're mysterious photographs. That just means that they may have some questions or some optical element that kind of gets me, continues to get me. In this case, for me, this image, thinking about kind of the sort of geometric shapes created by these white tags, but also the depth that's involved and other things that might be happening here, and also the sort of scenario of where this might even be encountered. this image would be a good example for me of thinking about an image that has ideas of levitation or receding space or some sort of optical confusion that's happening here, even though it's a very straightforward photograph. And then an image like this, thinking about how does one create a sculptural space that where the light emitted seems to be between the object and the shadow it's created. How does that sort of work? And so that's sort of lingering questions. I know how all these were made, of course, but the image kind of still reverberates on those levels. This last project is called Shadow Mantle, and it's the most recent project I've been working on for probably 2.5 years now, and I'll show you a few examples. And in this case, it started from thinking about the screen, not the computer screen so much, but the physical projection screen, like one might see at a movie theater, and how there's some kind of magic that happens on the screen, that images dance or they scare or whatnot, that there's something that happens on the surface of the screen that's intangible. If you went up and touched it, it would have no magic, but yet there's something that happens there. And so I was interested in this sort of space of what does that look like? Not recreating screens necessarily, but to think about what's the surface of that magic? What does that feel like? And so these are images of framed pieces from this project. And so these are thinking about the space of the photograph as having, again, a kind of three-dimensional placeness. How do they reveal photographic information, or how are these essentially built like they are drawings themselves? How am I creating these, adding or subtracting to these in the time of making, as if I'm either building them or I'm drawing them or sculpting them? And how do they sit as a flat image? This white sort of pointer coming in from the right is actually in the photograph, sort of, again, sort of breaks the sort of three-dimensionality of the scene, the small still life, what it is that represents, and then this thing flat on the surface of the image, but yet within the photographic space. And here, just thinking about multiple depths that happen within the photograph. In this case, we're looking through a kind of gauze that has objects in front of and beyond. And our area of focus is not 3 feet away, but it's actually 15 feet away. And this space that's in the yellow zone up sort of middle center, top middle center, is that area of focus. And yet because it's focused, it seems closer, but its detail is read as far away. And yet the image itself sort of plays and almost falls into the viewer, while this area of import, seeming import, the focus, sort of drifts further away. And so that kind of idea, that kind of sprinkling of an idea as a means, becomes the idea of the screen, becomes not a editing tool necessarily. It becomes just a vague guiding thought that then becomes the way that I think about this sort of literal space of the photograph as a means for composition, for creating ideas that move away from the content of the photograph, because as they recede from the reality of what's in front of them, as the photograph shows what's in front of it, the camera, it also, the content, because of its context, also recedes from that place. And so that's sort of thinking about that walled garden and that space of being in a literal natural scene, but having nothing to do with it. Those become the sort of guiding principles of what I'm working on throughout much of my work up until this point. So that's what I have. Thank you for that. I appreciate your time and your ability to let me share a little bit about my work with you. I appreciate that. I think we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Hi, everybody. If you do have questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A section. There should be a button somewhere in your toolbar in Zoom where you can type in questions, and I'll be able to read them aloud to John to answer. We do have a couple right now, and then I probably have a couple for myself. But I'll go ahead and start hitting away at the ones that are currently in the Q&A section. The first one we have is, do you think that your work has become more or less abstract over time?
I mean, I think that, let's kind of go back to an image. I think that its subject matter has become more pared down, but that, and so in that way it could seem abstract, but the camera is showing everything in very literal detail. So I pared down the subject matter, but I think that it has retained all the trappings of traditional photographic necessities. That's not quite the answer maybe somebody wanted, but I do think I think maybe the way to say it is that I'm interested in the reality of the photograph, and so pulling to complete abstraction, just shapes in front of a camera. I think that has less value for me, but I think that if I can show that these are constructions that then that act as abstractions, that's kind of an interesting space for me.
Yeah, and it actually kind of points to one of the questions I had. It wasn't maybe so much a question, but more just a thought. Thinking back to that photograph of people sitting in the desert in Egypt, and it almost seems that over time your work has gone into this trajectory where you've kind of just removed the figures from a photograph like that. So in every respect, the photograph kind of remains as photographic as it ever was. There's just fewer of these recognizable things.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought, because I think that it doesn't make a photograph like that fifth photograph any more abstract if you were to do that. It just it gives a more complicated entry level because the context is somewhat more obscure. And so certainly I'm obscuring that for the viewer in terms of what are they looking at. But there are remnants of clarity. For instance, this image here, thinking about, in real life, one could see that these are pieces of construction. There's painter's tape, and there's pieces of paper and other things that are recognizable. That would certainly be an interest. The same would be not to necessarily compare myself to Felix Gonzalez Torres, but to think about the artist's work that had two clocks on the wall, and the two clocks were a minute apart, and thinking about that kind of work as being super conceptual. But in fact, that's work that should be more understandable to the average contemporary viewer than 17th century oil painting, because these are materials and items that are more understood than that kind of experience. So yeah, I think that that is, it's the removal of the context. I think that's a good insight into it.
I have a couple related questions here. One is asking specifically about the process behind the images in The Fire Is Behind You, and then more of a just general question about process and perhaps like camera and film formats that you might be using to construct your various projects.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I especially think that question is kind of important right now. Not to say that camera types and things are terribly important for me. I'm really not a gear kind of guy, but for instance, in that project and the end of projects before that. Let me see. Let's see here. How can I go to this? Let's see. I'll just do that. So let me go back to this image here. Okay, so these two images here, and this is a project called Pack Ice. These two images became the beginning of when I lost my studio. And so I started creating temporary works in a parking garage. And so that became the space that I had to work. I think the reason I bring this up is, and I think this is important, is because this is a time where people's space has gotten very limited because of their access to quarantine and things like this. So how do you make do? And so this is a project that began in a parking garage, and the next series essentially was that same space. And so what we're looking at is thinking about these sort of oil stains on the pavement there as a way of accessing different kinds of information. That's not normally how it doesn't say that in the book. It doesn't suggest that. I give that, because we're sharing about our process. But for me, the work isn't necessarily about oil or anything like that. It's about this kind of doomed airspace or whatever it is. And these photographs which appear or have some basic adherence to the idea of a landscape photograph and what they could infer about a place, that really came from thinking about these kind of basic things that I had access to. And I think, yeah, just as we're all working through this current time, just thinking about sort of the very few things that we have access to, maybe, and how we can still make work or respond to the world. Maybe churning out the work isn't the most important part of right now, but certainly responding to the world is, and seeing the world. It's important as artists to examine the world and to understand it. I think that alone is a political act. And so your work need not necessarily be political, but to be aware of what's going on and aware of how you see it is important. And so, yeah, so I don't know, that doesn't really answer the question. File formats and things like that. I mean, some of this was shot digitally and some of it was shot not digitally. I shot film for a long time, and then at some point it became that I could make a lot more work if I shot digitally. So I would prefer to do that. So I shoot digitally because I have more creative control on the back end, that I can still retain the object of the final product. So.
And I guess since we're taking a look here at The Fire Is Behind You, another person was asking, where they can get your zines, or if
Oh,
this
that's
is
a good
something.
question. Some of you can just contact me directly. I used to have it. I have just a few copies of each left. Um, so if you just shoot me an email, I used to have a link and everything on my site, and they used to be in certain stores, but I'm down to so few that you can just shoot me an email. We'll get them for you. So.
Cool, good to know. I'm probably gonna take you up on that. Let's see, and actually, this person was also curious. This is more of a left field question, departing from what we were just talking about, but how it is that skate culture might have informed your interest in photography early on, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to really compare that. I mean, depending on the age of the person who's asked the question, comparing skate culture to what it is now is like totally different now. Now the camera is essentially basically the other tool in skateboarding, because you're 8 years old, you've done a good trick, you need a camera to document it so that you can become known. It wasn't quite like that in the 80s, but at the same time, that was really a tool for sharing what was happening across the country. This was obviously pre-internet, so you would use the camera to share what you were doing in terms of whether it's, then you take a couple photographs, and then in shop class or whatever in high school, you would print the photographs and then you'd Xerox them and send them to people, or you would, or even they would just turn up you'd see them in record stores, you'd see Xeroxed skate zines, or you'd see them at this, the one skate park in the Midwest. So that, while that was, photography seemed to kind of go with skateboarding in some way. Of course, it's now much greater, but and zine culture is less so now. But certainly to do it, sort of make it yourself happen kind of thing is certainly alive and well. And that's the great thing about a small publication, is that you can do it yourself. And these are rudimentary tools, and they don't need to be a $40,000 book project to get your ideas out there. So I like that idea. I still think that for me, that's not that I need to make zines, but I think that there's a lot that can be done on a small level. This book was produced for, I don't know, $300, and it has foil stamped cover. So it's like, I think that that's a kind of exciting possibility that can happen at kind of an interesting, affordable level.
So I actually want to have a personal extension on that question, because I myself was into skateboarding before I got into photography. And there seems to be a tremendous amount of people where that seems to be true, like photographers that I know.
Yeah.
And I'm always curious if you were somebody who was photographing people skateboarding, or you had people photographing you.
I mean, I've skateboarded for a long time, but I was definitely not the best one on at the place ever. So no, people weren't generally photographing me, although I suppose that did happen. But no, I've loved skateboarding for many years, and I think it's even how I see architecture and all kinds of things. That's all shaped by the way skateboarding is. But no, I was not the filmer either. I was not the guy who was going around shooting all that. It was just more part of the culture. So because of that, I was taking pictures. I wasn't so much even taking pictures of skateboarding, but because I knew people who were interested in photography, and it became a sort of a space that, I don't know. I mean, so many things happened for a funny reason. I wasn't able to get into any art classes in high school, so I got kicked into the printing class. Well, that turned out to be terribly helpful, which also the guy on the side decided he wanted to start a darkroom, which again turned out to be helpful. So so many of these like serendipitous things happened to me that maybe stemmed from a little bit of interest in seeing all these photos from skateboarding. So it wasn't that I was the filmer or that I was, you know, taking pictures of only skateboarders. That was not the case, but that kind of energy and excitement and sort of thinking creatively about how to do something that's maybe for a different purpose than what it was originally intended for. All that comes from skateboarding. That's a pretty important part.
Great. Well, it looks like we're at the end of the questions here and coming up just on an hour. So unless anybody has some last thoughts they want to drop in really quickly, I think I'll say we're going to conclude here.
All right. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And thanks again, John, for doing this lecture.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.